The landfill on the edge of Tucson had its own kind of weather. Not the kind that came from the sky, though the Arizona sky had plenty to offer in August heat, that pressed down like something with weight, the kind of heat that did not cool even after dark. The landfill had a weather that came from below, from the slow combustion of 10,000 discarded things all rotting in proximity, creating a warmth that was almost alive, almost breathing. It smelled of sweet rot and scorched plastic, and the particular dry bitterness of aluminum that had been baking in the sun since before anyone who worked there could remember. Clara Boone knew that smell the way most children know the smell of breakfast. It was not unpleasant to her. It was not pleasant either. It was simply morning, the smell of the beginning of work. She was 8 years old. Her feet were bare because the last pair of shoes that fit her had finally split along the sole 3 weeks ago, and the replacement pair was still a negotiation with the future. The soles of her feet were toughened by years of cracked asphalt and broken glass, and the particular texture of compressed refuse hardened into something that functioned as its own protection. She moved through the debris with the practiced precision of someone who has mapped a territory through repetition rather than study, who knows without looking which patches of ground yield and which hold firm, which shadows conceal glass and which are simply shadows. She was not playing. She had not played in a long time. Not because she had forgotten how, though she sometimes wondered about that in the moments between work and sleep, but because there was no margin for it. Her grandmother's breathing had turned wet and wheezy 3 nights before. The medicine was not free. The money did not appear from anywhere unless Clara went out and extracted it from the wreckage of other people's excess one piece at a time. She scanned the ground with eyes that had learned to categorize quickly. Old copper wire, the good kind, solid core worth carrying. A cracked phone casing with a circuit board that might still have recoverable components. A sheet of aluminum bent and sun-bleached, but with enough good metal left to justify the weight of it in the canvas bag she dragged behind her mom. She worked methodically, moving from one promising cluster to the next, her mind entirely occupied with the arithmetic of weight versus value versus distance to the scrapyard, the calculations she had been doing every morning for 2 years without being conscious of doing them. She almost missed him. Her bare foot caught on something that was not metal, was not plastic, was not the compressed cardboard or collapsed wood or any of the 100 other textures she had cataloged. It had weight to it, density, the stubborn yielding resistance of something that pushed back not because it was solid but because it was inhabited. Clara looked down. Her heart stopped in the specific way that hearts stop when the mind receives information it is not prepared to process. He was enormous, even lying collapsed in the filth at impossible angles, one arm thrown out wide and the other folded beneath him. At a wrong angle, he looked like something that had been built rather than born. 6'2", maybe more. His arms were covered in ink from wrist to shoulder, complex designs that had been laid down over years, a chronology of choices made permanent in skin. Flames and skulls and words in a script she could not read from where she stood, in the kind of imagery that speaks a specific language to people who know how to decode it. His leather vest was shredded at the collar and dark with stains, some old and set, some recent enough to still carry color. The patches were still visible despite the damage. A skull wreathed in fire, rendered in careful, deliberate stitching that had survived whatever had not survived. And above it, 3 words in blood-red thread, Iron Nomads, MC. His face was turned away from her, all set, even in unconsciousness, the muscles of it clenched with whatever the body fights against when the mind has gone elsewhere to save itself. A deep gash ran above his left temple, following the curve of the bone in a line that had bled heavily and dried to a dark, almost black crust in the afternoon heat. The skin around it was swollen and hot-looking, even from where she stood, the particular tight shine of inflammation. On his wrist, incongruous and almost insulting in its elegance, given everything else surrounding it, a heavy gold watch caught the afternoon sun and threw it back like a declaration, like something that had not agreed to be part of this. Clara stood frozen. Every instinct her 8 years had assembled, and they were considerable instincts, sharpened by necessity into something that functioned more like an adult's survival apparatus than a child's, said the same thing clearly and without equivocation. Run. Big man, biker, blood, unknown danger. Run right now and do not look back. Then she heard it. From somewhere deep in his chest, from whatever reserves a body draws on, when the conscious mind has abandoned the post and left the body to manage alone, a sound rose and broke the surface. Low, guttural, not aggressive, not a threat, not the sound of someone who is about to do something terrible. The raw, stripped-down frequency of a person fighting against something they cannot name. A man begging the darkness not to close in before he has had a chance to finish whatever he came here to do. Clara crouched. Her hand trembled as she reached toward his neck. She pressed two small fingers against the pulse point below his jawline, the way she had seen it done on the old television her grandmother kept beside the window. The one that got 3 channels clearly and 2 more if you held the foil-wrapped antenna at a specific angle. She had watched enough medical dramas in the evenings to know where the pulse lived and how to find it. She held still, breathed, waited. There, faint, irregular, skipping in places, but present, unambiguously present. She looked around quickly. The landfill had its own ecosystem in the late afternoon. The older kids who worked the eastern section would be heading toward the main path in another 20 minutes, and some of them had learned to look at her canvas bag with a calculation she did not enjoy. The men who gathered near the concrete barrier to the north had eyes that moved differently when they saw something worth taking, and the gold watch alone would rewrite every calculation being made within a quarter mile if it caught the wrong light at the wrong moment. The sun was beginning to lean westward, 2 hours, maybe 2.5 until dark. After dark, in this place for a man who could not defend himself, the head wound would be the least of his problems. Clara dug into her canvas bag. She had half a bottle of water. Her only one saved for the worst heat of the day carried the way a person carries something they cannot afford to lose. She uncapped it with care and tipped a slow, measured trickle past the man's cracked lips, watching to make sure he swallowed rather than aspirated, holding his jaw at the angle that made swallowing possible. His eyelids moved, fluttered, resisted, then opened. Gray eyes, pale as river stones, pale as the dry creek bed behind her grandmother's house in the early morning before the light got into it, completely lost, looking up at the August sky with the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere and has no framework for understanding how. Where? His voice came out fractured, raw, each word assembled from pieces that did not quite connect. Where the hell am I? The landfill, Clara said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. The voice of someone who understood that panic is a luxury and that they were not in a position to afford it. On the edge of Tucson, you have been here a while. You need to get up right now if you want to keep breathing. He tried to sit. The pain arrived before the movement was half complete and slammed him back down with the indifferent efficiency of physics. He lay still for a moment, chest heaving, eyes on the scar. Then his hand moved to the side of his head. He touched the wound, looked at the blood on his fingers with an expression that was not pain and was not shock. Something stranger, the look of a man examining something that belongs to a person he used to know. I don't. He stopped, started again. Something moved behind his eyes, a current beneath the surface, and what it was carrying was fear. Real fear, the particular terror of a person who has reached for the map and found the map is gone. I don't remember anything. I don't know who I am. I don't know how I got here. I don't know anything at all. Clara studied him for a long moment without speaking. She looked at the patches. She looked at the calloused hands, the kind of calluses that come from years of gripping something that vibrates, that requires force, that pushes back. She looked at the jaw, built for absorbing impact, and the shoulders built for carrying weight, and the eyes that even now, even lost and terrified, held something underneath the fear that had not yet surrendered. Something that was still present, still in the fight, even if it did not know what the fight was. She made her decision. It does not matter who you are right now, she said. She got to her feet and positioned herself beside him, working out the geometry of what needed to happen. What matters is that we move before anyone else comes through here and sees that watch. Getting a man of that size upright, using an 8-year-old as the sole support system, is not a procedure documented anywhere. Clara improvised. She got under his arm and used her whole body as a lever point, bracing her feet against the ground and pushing upward with her legs while he worked with whatever he could summon from a system that had been catastrophically depleted. The process was slow. It was ungainly. At one point, he nearly took them both back down, and she planted her feet wider and refused. He swayed, she held. He lurched forward. She was already moving. They walked. She guided him through the hidden paths, the trails she had mapped, through years of daily navigation away from the main routes where the wrong attention gathered. He moved in silence, except for the labor of his breathing and the occasional sharp exhale when his boot caught on buried debris, and the grunt of pain that he stifled quickly, the reflex of a man who had learned not to broadcast weakness regardless of circumstance. She moved faster than him, but never more than a step ahead, adjusting her pace to his without being asked. Her eyes never stopped moving. She watched every shadow, cataloged every shape that might be a person, ran the same calculations she ran every time she was in this place, but with a different variable in the equation now. "What is your name?" he managed after a few minutes. "Clara." A pause, the sound of two more difficult steps, the smell of the landfill beginning to thin as they moved toward its edge. "Thank you, Clara." The way he said it, stripped of everything, no performance in it, no social construction, just the raw grain of genuine gratitude from somewhere deep, told her more about who this man was than any amount of information about him could have. She did not answer. She kept her eyes on the path ahead. By the time they reached the landfill's edge, the city lights were beginning to blink on in the distance. The first ones, always the gas stations and the fast food places, lights that did not wait for full dark. He stopped without warning. Clara almost walked into him. He was looking at his own hands, turning them over in the failing light, examining the tattoos and the sketches in the heavy gold watch, as if they were artifacts from an excavation site, evidence of a civilization he was trying to reconstruct from its own physical remains. "Do you think I am dangerous?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Underneath the question was something she recognized because she had heard it in herself in the dark after bad days. The dread of an answer that confirms the worst version of what you suspect about yourself. Clara looked up at him, at those gray eyes that had dropped every defense because there was nothing left with which to defend. "Dangerous men do not look scared," she said. "You look terrified, so you are probably just in trouble." He had nothing to say to that. They kept walking. Neither of them understood in that moment what they were walking toward. Neither of them knew what would grow from this afternoon, from the specific choice Clara had made when her foot hit something that was not metal, and she stopped instead of continuing. That is the thing about moments that matter. They do not announce themselves. They arrive wrapped in the ordinary, in the smell of rot, in the failing sun, and the quiet of a person making a decision that will cost them nothing immediately and change everything eventually. The door of the house was painted wood that had been repainted several times over several decades, each new coat not quite covering what came before. The porch it opened onto was swept but not repaired. Two steps needed replacing. The window beside the door had a crack held together with electrical tape that had gone brown with age. In the window box that sat beneath it, mint grew with the particular vigor of something that has decided to thrive regardless of what the conditions suggest about whether thriving is appropriate. Clara pushed the door open with her shoulder. Warm light from inside, the smell of beans cooking, and the particular dry sweetness of a house that is clean despite having very little. Edna Briggs was in her chair by the window. Not asleep. She never slept in the evening anymore, not since the last medication adjustment. She was reading a library book with a cracked spine she had been keeping for 3 weeks longer than the due date, because returning it required a bus ride she had not had the money for, and the library had not called, and she intended to finish it before guilt became the deciding factor. She looked up when the door opened. Edna Briggs had had 73 years in which to develop a comprehensive and durable response to unexpected things. She had buried a husband. She had raised a daughter alone on wages that were an insult even by the standards of an era not known for generosity toward women working alone. She had watched that daughter make a series of choices that had their own internal logic, but that produced in aggregate a granddaughter she was now raising on beans and willpower, and the particular stubborn love of a woman who has decided she is not finished yet, regardless of what the circumstances might suggest about the wisdom of continuing. She did not rattle. It was one of the things about her that Clara had understood and relied on from very early. But when the door opened and she saw what was in it, her hand went to her chest before she could stop it. The man in the doorway filled it, even damaged, even sagging under the weight of blood loss and exhaustion, and whatever had been done to him before tonight, he occupied the space in a way that changed the room's relationship to itself. Leather vest, dark with stains, patches that said something specific to people who could read them. A head wound that had bled seriously and dried badly. And against his side bearing as much of his weight as she could manage her granddaughter. 50-something pounds of 8-year-old girl braced with the calm, focused determination of someone who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. "Grandma," Clara said in the voice she used when she had already thought something through completely and was informing the world of the conclusion. "I brought someone who needs help." Edna set her book down. She rose from her chair, which took longer than it used to, and required a negotiation with her joints, and she crossed the room. And she looked at this man the way a doctor looks at a patient, not with kindness first, with assessment, gathering information before deciding what to do with it, because information is the only thing that allows you to act correctly. Head wound, significant, real blood, loss over real time. The trembling in his legs was not weakness. It was the body burning through its last emergency reserves. His eyes were gray and searching and still lost, moving around the room trying to find something to orient to. In them, underneath the confusion, she saw something she had not expected to see. Shame. He was ashamed to be seen like this. By her, a woman he had never met. By both of them. She had not expected that from a man wearing those patches. His eyes found hers. Gray and careful. In them, something that was trying to take accurate measure of what she was and what she might do, and that seemed genuinely prepared to accept whatever verdict she arrived at. "Who is this man?" she said, turning to Clara. Not a shout, not a reprimand, the full authority of a woman who has never once needed to raise her voice to be heard. "And why is he in my house?" "I found him in the landfill, Grandma. He was badly hurt, and he cannot remember anything. We could not leave him there to die." "We," Edna repeated. The word was flat and precise as a surgical cut. "There is no we in that decision, child. There is you. And now there is this." The man spoke. His voice was rough, scraped raw, but the steadiness in it was real. The steadiness of a man calling on reserves of dignity he should not have had left and was summoning anyway. "Ma'am, I am sorry. I did not ask her to bring me here. If you want me to go, I will go." He meant it. Edna could see that with complete clarity. He was not performing willingness to leave. His weight was already shifting toward the door. His jaw was set against what movement was going to cost him. His legs buckled. Clara caught him. All 50-something pounds of her planted between him and the floor, her arms around his waist, her feet braced against the boards, refusing to let him fall with the absolute conviction of a person who has made a decision and is not interested in revising it regardless of what physics suggests. Edna looked at this, at her granddaughter holding up a man 4 times her size on nothing but will and the certainty that she was right. She said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then she sighed, the deep, total, surrendering sigh of a woman who has recognized something inevitable and is choosing consciously to stop fighting it. "Get him to the sofa," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "Do not let him bleed on the floor. I just cleaned it." The sofa was small, and he barely fit on it. He sat on the edge with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, occupying as little space as a man his size could manage, as though he understood that space was not surplus in this house and was making an accounting of himself accordingly. Edna returned with a basin of hot water and a cloth that was clean and folded with more dignity in its neatness than most of what surrounded it. She sat in the small wooden chair across from him and began cleaning the wound on his temple. Her movements were efficient, practiced carrying no cruelty and no false tenderness, just competence. The competence of a woman who has managed difficult situations for 50 years and understands that competence is itself a form of care. He winced when the cloth touched the wound. He did not make a sound. Clara sat nearby with her canvas bag and cleaned the things she had found that morning, cataloging each item with the focused attention she gave everything. Her eyes moved occasionally to the man on the sofa and then back to her work. "Those patches," Edna said, not looking up, "iron nomads." "Yes, ma'am. Men with no fixed chapter. They ride alone but answer when the brotherhood calls." She pressed the cloth against the wound with deliberate pressure. "That is either very free or very dangerous." "Sometimes both," he said. She looked at him then directly for the first time since sitting down. Her eyes were dark and steady, carrying the weight of a long life spent learning to see past what people showed to what they actually were. "You know about that world?" he asked. "I know about every world," she said. "When you are poor, you learn to read people quickly. It is not optional." She returned to the wound. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of two people taking the measure of each other honestly, without the social lubrication that people with more to protect tend to apply. Promises from men in your world carry no weight here, Edna said, not unkindly, as a statement of fact that the situation required being honest about. Rich or rough, it makes no difference in this house. What I can see is that you are a man carrying a very expensive problem. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. I think that is exactly what I am. Dinner was 3 small plates of pinto beans cooked with a dried chili pepper and handmade flour tortillas that Edna had assembled from the end of that week's supply. Clara helped roll them, working at the counter beside her grandmother, with the practiced ease of someone who has participated in this same ritual hundreds of times. There was a particular rhythm to the way they moved around each other in the small kitchen, the accommodations and adjustments of people who know each other's geography completely. Without comment, without ceremony, Edna set the fullest plate in front of the stranger. Clara noticed. She always noticed. They ate in a silence that should have been awkward and managed not to be entirely. The man ate slowly at first, with the careful, tentative movements of someone relearning a process rather than simply performing it, then with something deeper than hunger. A quality to the eating that went below the body's need. The specific quality of a person eating because they have arrived for the first time in some stretch of time they cannot yet measure somewhere that is not the immediate edge of disaster. Halfway through the meal, his hand drifted to the watch on his wrist. His thumb found the small raised button set into the side of the casing, almost invisible unless you knew it was there. He pressed it without conscious decision, the way a person reaches for something familiar without choosing to. A voice filled the small kitchen, female rendered by a digital recording, but carrying within it the particular inflection of something chosen carefully, something recorded with deliberate warmth. For Dax, with all my love, Lena. The name fell into the room, and the room changed in the way that rooms change when something true enters them. He sat with it, turned it over, tried it the way you try a word in a language you once knew fluently, finding the shape of it familiar while the meaning remains just out of reach. Dax, something moved. Not quite recognition, the first degree of it, the beginning of thaw. He tried the other name, Lena. And what rose from that name was not warmth, not the thing you would expect when a voice says your name attached you to love. What rose was cold, a specific localized cold at the base of his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room and everything to do with something the body knows before the mind is ready to know it. Clara had gone still across the table. Her eyes, which missed nothing and judged only carefully, were on his face. Is that your name? She asked. Dax. I think so. Still turning it over, testing it against the blank interior. It fits something. And who is Lena? The question hung between them. Edna had put down her fork. She was watching him with the same steady, unhurried attention she gave everything. The attention of a woman who does not interrupt a process before it has completed itself. I do not know, Dax said. The coldness remained patient and quiet, sitting at the base of his spine and waiting. But something about that name does not feel the way it should. Edna looked at him for a long moment from across the table. Sometimes, she said, the things that hurt us most are the ones we were closest to. She picked up her fork. Sleep on it. The truth finds you whether you look for it or not. That night, after Edna had shown him the blanket clean smelling of laundry soap folded with a precision and care that made it feel like more than a blanket, and after Clara had disappeared behind the curtain to the back of the house, Dax lay in the dark and stared at the low ceiling and tried to think. The house breathed around him. The metal roof expanded and contracted as the desert air cooled, ticking quietly. Wind moved through the ocotillo outside the window, a dry scratching sound that came and went in rhythm with the gusts. From behind the curtain, the deep, steady breathing of a child who slept with the completeness that belongs only to children, the sleep of someone who has done what the day required and has given the rest of it back. He turned the watch over on his wrist in the dark, pressed the button again softly, just enough to feel the vibration of it activating, stopped it before the words came through. He already knew what it said. The cold came back when he sat with the name Lena. He did not push the cold away. He sat with it, trying to understand what the cold knew that he did not yet. He thought about the two people asleep a few feet away. The old woman with the iron spine and the eyes that saw straight through a person without apology. The child who had poured her only water into a stranger's mouth and then refused on some deep internal principle, that no one had taught her to leave him to whatever the landfill would have done to him after dark. He did not know who he was. He did not know what he had been or what had been done to him or who had decided he needed to end up in the garbage. But lying in the dark with the sounds of the house around him, he understood something with the absolute wordless certainty of a conviction that does not require evidence. Whatever had come before, whatever world he had ridden through, whatever brotherhood he had bled for, and enemies he had made, and things he had built and lost, he would not let harm come to these two. The vow formed without ceremony, without language, from somewhere below language. It was simply the first solid thing he had felt since opening his eyes in the garbage and finding a child looking down at him, and he held on to it. Outside, the moon crossed the landfill that had nearly been his grave. Inside, for the first time in a stretch of time, he could not yet measure, Dax slept. 2 streets away, a man in dark clothes put a phone to his ear. The voice that answered was educated, measured, and entirely empty of anything that could be mistaken for concern. They had a location range. They were narrowing it. They had been given a window and they intended to use it. The man in dark clothes said he understood. He looked at the houses beyond the landfill's edge with the patient, systematic eyes of someone who had been paid very well to be thorough and who took the payment seriously. The morning came without apology. The sun arrived through the eastern window with immediate full force and announced itself as a fact. Dax was already awake. He had been awake for 2 hours before the sun came, lying still on the too small sofa in the dark, doing what some buried part of him had apparently done long enough to become automatic. Cataloging sounds, the house settling, the refrigerator cycling, the wind against the window frame, the distant sound of traffic building on the road to the east. He was mapping the acoustic landscape of the space building, a model of what normal sounded like, so he would know immediately when something stopped being normal. He did not remember learning to do this. He suspected he had been doing it most of his life. Edna appeared in the kitchen without announcement. She moved around the small space with the focused economy of someone who has made this same coffee, in this same pot, in this same way, for enough mornings that the process required nothing from her conscious mind. She measured the grounds by feel. She set the pot on the flame. She turned and looked at him without appearing to turn. She set a cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it. The warmth moved through his palms and up into his arms, and he sat with that for a moment with the specific, unreasonable gratitude of a person receiving something simple that they needed more than they could account for. "You were awake all night," Edna said. She sat across from him, folding her hands on the table with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who has decided to say something and intends to say it properly. "Most of it. Thinking or remembering." He looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "A significant one. Thinking is what your mind does when it works. Remembering is when your past comes back to collect what it is owed." She studied him with those dark, steady eyes. "Which one is it?" "Both," he said. "I keep seeing pieces, fragments, like someone dropped something and I am finding the shards one at a time." "What do you see in the shards?" He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. The warmth of it, the weight. "A room. High up glass walls, chrome everywhere. The kind of space that costs something just to be in." He paused, holding the image, which was slippery image size, not yet story. "Men in suits, a long table, someone handing me a drink, smiling while they handed it to me." Edna was quiet. She gave the silence room to exist without moving to fill it. "The smile," she said carefully. "Was it warm?" "No," Dax said. "It was the kind of smile that means something else entirely." She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman confirming something she had suspected. She reached across the table and refilled his cup without being asked, and in that small motion was everything she was choosing not to say out loud, and that everything was considerable. Clara appeared minutes later, hair wild, immediately and completely awake in the particular way of children who have not yet learned to ease into the day. She pulled out her chair and sat and tore off a piece of bread and began eating with the focused appetite of someone who treats food as necessary fuel rather than an experience. "Good morning, Dax," she said with the naturalness of someone greeting a household member of long standing. He said good morning. Something about the ordinary transaction of it settled something in him. "Can you work today?" she asked without looking up from the bread. "The garden needs watering. The back fence has been leaning for a week. Edna says if it falls, Mrs. Hartley's dog gets through and ruins the vegetable bed." Clara, Edna said with the particular gentle quality that was also a warning. He said he would help, Clara said with the reasonable tone of someone who considers the matter settled. So he should help. Dax looked at Edna. Edna looked at Dax. Something moved between them in the pause, the quiet, slightly resigned acknowledgement of two people who have both just been outmaneuvered by an 8-year-old and have no clear response that doesn't involve dignifying it. She's not wrong, Dax said. He worked. It was more humbling than he had anticipated, and he had anticipated something. His hands bore the evidence of considerable experience doing difficult physical things. They were the hands of a man who had not arrived at his win and his bearing through inactivity. But they turned out to be almost entirely useless at the well. The rope caught in the wrong places. The rhythm evaded him. He overthought the pull and underestimated the arc of descent and lost the bucket twice to the counterweight he had not accounted for. The rope burned his palms in new places over existing calluses that had been built for entirely different work. Clara watched this for approximately 40 seconds. Then she stepped in. "You are fighting it," she said. Her voice was instructional and patient, the voice of an expert watching a beginner make fundamental errors and having decided to intervene. "Stop fighting. Let the weight of the bucket do the work on the way down. Save your strength for the pull." He tried it her way. The bucket descended cleanly. He pulled. It came up full and steady. He stood there with water dripping from the rope onto the cracked earth and felt something move in him that was not a memory and was not grief and was not the cold that came when he thought of certain names. It was something newer than any of those things. Something that required a moment to identify because it was less familiar to him than he liked. Respect. Genuine and complete. In the afternoon, while Edna rested and the house went quiet with the particular quiet of the desert at its full heat, Clara walked him through the garden. She moved through it the way certain people move through spaces they have tended long enough to feel responsible for. Each plant had a name and a status and a particular relationship to the whole, and she knew all of them with the intimacy of daily attention. "Mint," she said, crouching beside a cluster of dark green plants along the southern wall. "For stomach problems. Edna makes a tea. She also uses it for headaches, which she will tell you she does not have, but she does." She moved along the row with the authority of someone conducting a tour of something that matters. "Tomatoes, still green. Do not touch them yet." She pointed to a cluster of low plants near the fence. "Those are the ones that matter most. We eat those when everything else runs out." Dax crouched beside them. His knee announced its displeasure with the motion, a deep pop that she heard clearly. She glanced at it without changing expression. "You ride a lot," she said. He looked up. "What makes you say that?" "Your knees. My grandmother's friend, Mr. Domingo, used to ride horses every day for 40 years. His knees sound exactly like that." She tilted her head, assessing him with the calm thoroughness she brought to assessment. "Also, the calluses on your left hand are different from your right. You grip something that vibrates, something that pushes back against you." Dax stared at her. "I am A.A.," she said, reading his face with the accuracy of someone who has been reading faces since before she had words for what she was doing. "Not blind." They fixed the fence. Or rather, Dax fixed the fence, while Clara handed him tools and informed him when he was angling the posts incorrectly, which was often enough to be instructive. By the time the fence stood plumb and the sun had moved to the western edge of the sky, his shirt was completely soaked through, and his hands had acquired new blisters over the rope burns. He had not felt this specifically tired in recent memory. He had also not felt this specifically satisfied. That evening, the three of them sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and for the first time since Dax had arrived, the conversation moved somewhere real. "Do you have family?" Edna asked. "Somewhere beyond the name on that watch." Dax turned the question over. A fragment surfaced, not a complete memory, a texture, the feeling of a particular door, a voice on the other side of it that he had been too occupied to answer properly too many times over too many years. "I think I have a daughter," he said. The words came slowly, each tested before release. "I cannot remember her name, but I can feel the shape of her, the way you can feel a word that is just at the edge of where your mind can reach." He looked at the table. "And I think I let her down. Before any of this, whatever this is. I think I let her down consistently over a long time and told myself the work justified it." Clara was watching him. Her eyes held their usual quality of seeing more than faces were designed to show. "You should fix that," she said, "when you remember how to find her." "I know." People wait longer than they should, Edna said. The weight in those words was not philosophical. It came from somewhere much closer than philosophy. The silence that followed held things: grief, regret, the particular ache of time spent in ways that cannot be unspent. Dax let it settle over him and did not try to move it. There was something right about sitting in it with these two people in this small house with the smell of dinner still in the air and the desert going dark outside. He was still sitting in it when the sound came. Not a knock, a voice outside on the street. Measured, educated, carrying the quality of men asking questions they have already verified the answers to and are simply confirming the last details before acting on them. Dax was on his feet before he finished processing what he heard. Some part of him had been waiting for this since before the sun came up. The part that catalogs sounds. The part that never entirely stood down. He was at the window, pressing his back against the wall beside the frame, angling one eye to see without being seen. Two men, dark clothing, no club colors, no identifying patches. These were not brotherhood. These were professionals wearing the posture of authority, the way certain men wear its shoulders, set chins level, the practiced manner of people who have been hired to project control over whatever space they occupy. One was talking to a neighbor 3 doors down. The other was scanning the street. His eyes moved in a pattern, systematic, methodical, working outward from a fixed center point in overlapping arcs, eliminating possibilities, contracting towards something specific. They had a range, they were working it. These were not police. Police scan differently. They look for anomaly, for deviation from pattern. These men were looking for something specific that matched a description they had been given. They had been sent with parameters. They were doing a professional job. Dax's stomach became something cold and dense. How many? Edna's voice was directly behind him, very quiet. He had not heard her move. Too visible, probably more positioned elsewhere. Are they looking for you specifically or working an area? He watched the scanner, timed the arcs. They have a range. They are contracting it. They are close. Edna nodded once. Her face was entirely composed, not the composure of someone suppressing fear. The composure of someone who has assessed a situation, arrived at a course of action, and is proceeding. Then she walked to the front door and opened it. Edna. The name came out of him before he could stop it. She stepped outside before he finished saying it. He pressed back against the wall, watching through the gap in the curtain, as Edna Briggs, 73 years old, with a compromised heart and arthritic joints and less financial security than most people would consider survivable, walked across her porch and down her steps and directly toward the two men with the unhurried confidence of someone who owns every inch of ground beneath her feet. Evening. Her voice carried clearly in the still air. Neighborly, entirely unperturbed. You two look like you are searching for something. Can I help? The taller man turned. Professional face, professional smile. The specific warmth that people deploy when warmth is a tool. We are looking for a large man, tattoos, possible head injury. Have you seen anyone matching that in this neighborhood? Edna tilted her head. The specific gesture of a woman searching her memory, and she had been making this exact gesture for 73 years, so it was absolutely authentic. A man like that came through here 2 days ago. Scared my chickens half to death. A pause as if recollecting the detail. He headed south, I think, toward the rail yard, moving fast like someone looking for a place to sleep. She looked at them with the mild, appropriate concern of an elderly woman who lives in a neighborhood where such things occasionally happen. Is he dangerous? Should I be worried about my granddaughter walking to school? The two men exchanged the fraction of a glance that passes between people who have their own language for these moments. Nothing to worry about, ma'am, the tall one said. Thank you for your time. She watched them walk south. She stood on the street in the evening and watched them go and gave it a full minute, and then she turned and walked back inside and latched the door behind her. She looked at Dax. He had no words. None at all. Not for what she had done in the last 90 seconds. Not for what it would cost her if those men came back and understood that the elderly woman on the quiet street had lied to them with complete composure while the person they were looking for stood 15 feet behind her. Close your mouth, she said, moving back toward the kitchen. I will make more coffee. Clara was in the corner where she had been standing entirely still and quiet since the moment Edna had opened the door. Her expression was the expression of a child who has long ago accepted that the person raising her operates by standards that most people cannot access. Not surprised, not awed in the way that implies unexpectedness. Simply confirmed. Dax sank back against the wall. His hands, which had been steady through all of it, were shaking now. The delayed reaction of a system that had been running on emergency protocols finally receiving the message that the immediate threat had passed. Those men had not come to ask questions. They had come to confirm a location and finish what someone had started in the landfill. And this woman had bought him time he had not earned and could not repay, using nothing but her age and her composure and the absolute conviction that she had the right to protect the person under her roof regardless of what protecting them might cost her. He lay awake long after the house went dark. He thought about the drink, the room, the smile that meant something else. He thought about the name Lena and the cold it produced. He thought about a different name, one that lived right at the edge of where his memory reached and stopped. Not a person's name, a surname. Something attached to the chrome and glass room and the long table and the men in suits and the smile. Morris. He did not know yet what it attached to. He did not know what it explained or what it had cost him. But the feeling it produced sitting alone in the dark in this small house while two people slept a few feet away was the feeling of a man standing at the edge of something very large, just beginning to understand the shape of it. The memory did not return all at once. That is not how it works, regardless of what the movies suggest. It does not arrive in a single clarifying flood organized and labeled, ready to be processed. It comes back the way a tide comes in, slowly, then suddenly, then all at once, with a force that takes your legs before you realize the water has reached you. It started with smell. Edna had brewed coffee before sunrise, measured by feel, and heated without ceremony the way she did every morning. Something in the steam that particular morning was different. Dark, bitter, carrying beneath the warmth, a sharp undertone that his body recognized before his mind had any idea what was happening. A chemical memory, the kind that bypasses the thinking brain entirely and goes straight to the part that remembers things the thinking brain was not present for. Dax was standing in the kitchen, both hands around his cup when it hit him. He had to grab the counter. The fragment that came was not fragment-sized. It was full and complete and three-dimensional, and it smelled like that coffee and like expensive scotch and like the particular cold air of a climate-controlled room 40 floors above a city that did not yet know what was happening in it. A boardroom, chrome and glass, the city laid out below like a map of something owned. A table long enough to land a plane on, and around it, the men he had spent 15 years building toward. Men in suits who had never in their professional lives been required to do something with their actual hands. Men whose wealth was the product of other people's labor, translated through so many layers of financial instrument that the labor itself had become invisible. At the head of the table, Stuart Mercer, his business partner of 11 years, his oldest professional relationship, the man who had been there at the beginning, who had believed in the idea before the idea had any evidence to support belief, who had sat across from him in a rented office with 2 folding chairs and a whiteboard and said, "Yes, let's do this. This is worth doing." Stuart smiling the smile that Dax had spent 11 years reading as warmth, and that he now understood in this kitchen, holding a counter in Tucson, had never been warmth, had always been something else, something patient and cold and very, very long-sighted. "Here, Dax, you look tense, drink." The glass, the scotch, the bitter undertaste beneath it that he had noticed in the fraction of a second before dismissing it because Stuart had handed it to him, and you do not question the man who has been in the foxhole with you since before there was anything worth protecting. You do not question 11 years of that. You accept the drink. He had accepted the drink. He had accepted the darkness that followed. The nausea came fast, and he held onto the counter with both hands and breathed through it slow and deliberate, the way you breathe through something you cannot stop. Holden Ironworks. He had built it from a piece of paper and an irrational conviction and 15 years of his body's actual labor. He had turned those things into something that employed 800 people and held contracts across 4 states, a company that had been, by any measure, he knew how to apply something worth being proud of. Stuart had been moving money for over a year, quietly, systematically, with the patience of a man who understands that the difference between theft and transfer is paperwork and timing. He had been restructuring accounts, establishing holding entities, creating the legal architecture of a takeover so clean that when Dax disappeared, the transition would look like a senior partner assuming operational control, during an unexpected health crisis. Everything labeled correctly, everything defensible. And Lena, his wife, the voice on the watch, with all my love. He had married her in the second year of the company when everything was still precarious, and the future was something you had to choose to believe in because the present did not support it. He had believed she believed in it with him. He had carried that belief through 12 years of a marriage conducted largely in his absence. A marriage to a man who was always working, always building, always oriented toward the next thing, who came home late and left early, and told himself that the thing he was building was for her, for them, for the future they would inhabit once the work was done. The work had never been done, and Lena had found someone to inhabit the present with while Dax inhabited the future. Stuart and Lena had been working together for 14 months. The drink had been the final piece. The car that took him to the landfill, the hands that removed his phone and wallet and left him face down in the garbage with a head wound, and nothing else, those had been hired. Clean, deniable. The whole operation had the particular elegance of a plan revised many times until every rough edge is gone. They had not counted on the rough edge named Clara Boone. He straightened. Let the shape of it settle into him completely. She was beside him before he decided to turn around. Clara, who had materialized from wherever she had been with the quiet speed of a child who moves through spaces without announcing herself. Dax, her voice was low and steady. Look at me. He looked at her, those 8-year-old eyes, steady as anything he had ever looked at, holding him in the present with the simple authority of a person who understands that panic is expensive and they cannot afford it. I remember, he said. His voice came out flat, emptied of something. I remember everything. They sat at the kitchen table, all three of them. Clara beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm. She did not move away. He did not ask her to. Edna sat across from him with her hands folded and listened the way she listened to everything, giving each piece its full weight before moving to the next, not filling the spaces with reassurance or reaction. He told them all of it. Stuart Mercer, Lena, the accounts, the holding companies, the legal architecture of a theft so carefully constructed that it would have been nearly impossible to challenge from outside. The drink, the car, the landfill, all of it in sequence, every detail he could access laid out on the table between them. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. They did not count on me, Clara said. It was not a boast. It was the straightforward observation of a person stating what was plainly true, delivered in the same factual tone she used for everything else. The tomatoes are still green. The fence was leaning. They did not count on me. Dax looked at her. Something broke open in his chest, not the cold, not the grief or the fury or the humiliation of understanding how comprehensively he had been fooled by the people he had trusted most. Something older than any of those things. Something that had been sealed for a long time, longer than the landfill, longer than he had been willing to admit to himself in the years before any of this. He had built an empire. He had spent 15 years building it with the conviction that the building was the point, that accumulation was the measure, that the size of what he made was an accurate reflection of what he was. And then an 8-year-old girl with no shoes and a canvas bag had found him in the trash and poured her only water into his mouth. He looked at this child, this small, serious, extraordinary girl who walked through a landfill every morning of her life looking for something worth saving, and had found him. No, he said softly, they did not count on you. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Dax had not expected to find meaningful, and found profoundly meaningful despite himself. He woke before the sun and lay still, mapping the sounds of the house until the light came. He drank coffee across from Edna, in the particular silence she had established for mornings, the silence of two people who had each arrived at an understanding of what early hours were for. Then Clara appeared and the day began. He grew better at the well. The rope no longer burned in new places. He had stopped fighting the physics of it the way Clara had told him to, and the bucket came up clean and full. He fixed the section of roof that leaked over the kitchen when the monsoon rains came. He reinforced the second porch step and replaced the third entirely. He cleared the drainage channel along the property's edge so the next rain would not pool against the foundation. He was not doing these things to repay a debt. He understood that the debt could not be repaid, that what Edna and Clara had given him had no monetary equivalent. He was doing them because they needed doing, and he was present and capable, and the doing of them gave the day a structure that kept the cold from taking over everything. In the afternoons, Clara was his teacher. She knew the properties of every plant in the garden. She knew which neighbors were trustworthy and which were not, and her assessments of both categories were accurate in ways that took him several days to verify. She knew the bus schedule, the price of every staple at the 3 grocery stores within walking distance, and the specific hours when the library was least crowded and therefore most useful. "You watch everything," he said one afternoon while she directed him in staking the tomato plants. "I have to," she said. It was not complaint, it was simply category, the category of necessary things. "Who taught you that?" She was quiet for a moment, tying a soft strip of cloth around a stem. "No one taught me. I noticed that not watching had consequences." He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about the boardroom, about 11 years of meetings with Stuart Mercer, during which Stuart had been watching everything and Dax had been watching the horizon. The fragment of the door surfaced again, more complete each time it came. A specific door with a small dent in the lower panel. Himself standing outside it, hand raised to knock. Not knocking, walking away, coming back weeks later, doing the same thing. That evening after Clara had gone to bed, he and Edna sat in the 2 chairs by the front window with cups of tea. "I think I have a daughter," he said. "I am certain of it now. I can see the door to her room. I can see myself not going through it. Over and over. I can see that." Edna said nothing. "She is 15, I think," he said. "I missed a lot of 15. I missed a lot of years." "You did," Edna said. Not harshly, as a fact that needed to be on the table before anything useful could be built on top of it. "The question," she said, "is not what you missed. You cannot go back into time already spent. The question is what you do now when you have the chance." She picked up her tea. The street outside was quiet. "People use the past as an excuse not to act in the present," she said. "They tell themselves that because they failed before they are people who fail, and so there is nothing to be done. That is not wisdom. That is convenience." They sat with it together, the particular comfort of 2 people who have reached the same understanding from different directions. He was sitting with that comfort when the sound came back. A single vehicle moving slowly. Slowly enough, he heard it stop. A door. He was at the window. One man, standing at the end of the block with a phone, looking at it, then looking at the houses, comparing, matching an address from a list. They had narrowed it significantly. He stepped back from the window. His mind was working fast and clean, now all the pieces of himself coming back online together for the first time. He could not stay here. The thought arrived with the clarity of something that had been true for a while and was finally being allowed into the room. Every additional day he spent in this house was another day these 2 people were a liability away from something irreversible. He had no illusions about what the people who had hired those suits were willing to do to resolve a loose end. Edna was beside him. She looked at the man with the phone. She looked at him. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Tomorrow, the day after at the outside." She nodded once. "And when you go, I fix all of it. Stuart, the company, everything. And then I come back." She turned from the window and looked at him with the full attention she gave everything. "You make sure," she said, "that when you say you are coming back, you mean it. Clara has had enough people tell her things they meant at the time." It landed exactly where she intended. "I mean it," he said. She held his gaze for the moment it took to verify something only she knew how to verify. Then she went back to her chair. He spent the next day in the garden with Clara because there was work to be done and because he did not know how to sit with what was coming without doing something with his hands. "If you take too much," Clara said, carefully pruning the tomato suckers, "the plant cannot recover. But if you do not take enough, it spends all its energy on things that cannot bear fruit." He was not certain she understood she was describing something much larger than a garden. In the afternoon, Edna called him in. She was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, and beside it a small metal box. She opened it. Money carefully folded, not a large amount. The kind that buys a bus ticket and a meal and a phone call. "You will need to make contacts," she said. "Someone Stuart does not know about." He thought, the boardroom full of suits, the attorneys and advisors who had orbited Holden Ironworks for 15 years. Most of them were Stuart's people now, or were afraid of Stuart's people. The practical outcome was the same. One name surfaced from below the obvious: Fletcher. Nate Fletcher, an attorney who had been brought into the company in the early years and pushed out by Stuart with the particular efficiency Stuart brought to removing inconveniences. Fletcher had not been happy about it. He had not been vocal. He had packed his things and left, and had been practicing estate law in a suburb of Tucson for the 3 years since. 3 years of waiting with 40 pages of notes, it turned out. I have someone, Dax said. He also had a decision he had been turning over for 2 days. He looked at the watch. Edna was watching him look at it. She needs surgery, he said. The heart, the doctor at the community clinic said last month. He had gathered this from listening carefully to the fragments of information that moved through a small house. I know what that costs. You have a watch, she said. I have a watch that covers it and more, he said. And I know who I am. I do not need it to tell me. Something moved across Edna's face. The internal version of a smile. The kind that does not require an audience. Do what you need to do, she said. That evening, without announcement, without warning, Edna collapsed. She was moving from the stove to the table, a motion she had made 10,000 times in this kitchen, and then she was not moving at all. The cups hit the floor. The sound of them was wrong. Dax had her before the echo finished. He had crossed the kitchen in a movement he did not plan, pure reflex, and she was in his arms on the floor. Her weight slight and terrible, her eyes open, and her hand pressed to her own chest with a grip that said everything before the expression on her face confirmed it. Her heart. Edna, stay with me, look at me. Her eyes found his, clear, focused, communicating something that was not fear but that was very much aware of what was happening. Clara was in the doorway in her pajamas. He did not know when she had appeared. She was looking at her grandmother with complete stillness, the stillness of a child who has learned that certain moments require you not to fall apart regardless of what falling apart would feel like. No words. Dax stood. He picked Edna up. She was lighter than she should have been. He went to the front door. He did not think about the man with the phone. He did not think about Stuart Mercer or the accounts or any of it. There was only the weight of this woman in his arms and the distance between here and help. Clara was already beside him. Shoes on, Ted. She had put them on and tied them herself in the time it had taken him to stand up. The cab stopped because some situations override normal calculations. A man the size of a defensive lineman standing in the middle of a street holding an unconscious elderly woman with a small girl running alongside is one of those situations. The driver took one look and drove. The hospital was everything hospitals are at midnight. Fluorescent light with no interest in being gentle. Plastic chairs in institutional colors. The smell of antiseptic that suggests desperation more than cleanliness. They waited. Clara sat beside him with her shoulder against his arm and her feet not quite reaching the floor. She did not cry. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the door through which Edna had disappeared, and she breathed steadily, and she did not cry him. Dax looked at the watch. He thought about Edna walking out her front door toward two men who intended to find him using nothing but age and composure. He thought about the folded blanket that smelled of laundry soap. He thought about coffee refilled without being asked. He stood up. He told Clara he would be back. She looked at him with those eyes that saw everything. He walked out of the hospital into the Tucson night. He came back an hour later. His wrist was bare, his pocket was full. Clara was awake when he sat down. She looked at his wrist immediately, then at his face. You sold it, she said. It was just metal. It was your only proof of who you were. I know who I am, Dax said. I do not need it anymore. She looked at him for a moment, not checking whether he meant it, simply confirming something she had already determined to be true. Then she nodded once and leaned back against his side. The doctor came out at 20 past midnight, young, exhausted, significant cardiac event, surgery required, high risk at her age. The procedure would cost considerably more than most insurance programs in this bracket would cover. Dax reached into his pocket without hesitation. He laid the money on the chair between them. Do what needs to be done, he said. I will cover the rest. The surgeon looked at him. At the vest, the tattoos, the healing scar above his temple, the road-worn hands. Whatever she had been about to say, she decided against saying it. We will prepare the surgical suite, she said. The surgery took 4 hours. Dax did not sleep. Clara did eventually, her head tipping sideways against him, her breathing going deep and steady as the waiting room emptied and refilled and emptied again. He sat with her weight against his side, and he did not move. At dawn, the surgeon appeared. Stable. The procedure had gone well. She was strong, the surgeon said, with the specific emphasis of someone who had encountered in 4 hours of intimate work on a person's interior, evidence of something formidable. Clara made a sound. It was not quite crying. It was the sound that escapes when something held very tightly for a very long time is finally released. Relief and grief at the same time, the particular emotional collision of a person who understands only in the moment of safety how frightened they have been. He held her while she shook. And in the disinfectant air, in the fluorescent light of the waiting room at dawn, with this child's hands gripping the front of his vest, the last sealed room in his memory opened completely. He saw Paige, 15 years old, and standing in the doorway of the room at the end of the hall, the one with the dent in the lower panel of the door, not looking at him with anger, not even with hurt exactly, with the expression of a girl who has recalibrated her expectations of her father downward so many times that the recalibration itself has become the expectation. Who has stopped being surprised when he does not show up because being surprised required a baseline expectation of showing up that she has long since abandoned. He had done that, not Stuart, not Lena, him, his absence, his relentless self-narrated devotion to the work that was always for the future and never for the present, for the company that was always the next thing that needed building and never the door at the end of the hall that needed opening. The grief of that in the hospital waiting room at dawn was sharper than any physical wound. Because wounds heal. The things you fail to do are recorded differently. I have to fix things, he said aloud. The words came out of him without decision, called out by what he was sitting with. Clara looked up at him. The company, he said. My daughter. Everything. He found the last payphone in Tucson on the ground floor of the hospital. He fed coins into the slot. He dialed the number from memory. The phone rang 3 times. This is Fletcher. Cautious. The caution of a man who has learned that unexpected calls tend to carry specific statistical distributions of outcomes. Nate, Dax said. It is Dax Holden. Silence. 4 full seconds. Mr. Holden? The caution had changed register. Something beneath it. Something that was not quite relief, because relief requires surprise, and Fletcher had apparently been waiting for this. Everyone believed you were dead. I know, Dax said. Stuart Mercer made a mistake. Where are you calling from? Tucson General. Does not matter. Nate, I need you to listen. Stuart has been moving money for over a year. I need the account structures forensically reconstructed from the outside. I need an emergency injunction with the fraud division before he can initiate the final transfer sequence. And I need the original articles of incorporation from the county clerk because my signature on the founding documents supersedes every subsequent amendment regardless of what the current board has approved. Silence on the line, a man running calculations at speed. Do you have documentation of the tampering? Memory, which is not enough. You will need to build from the financial trail. It is there. Stuart is meticulous, which means thorough, which means traces everywhere. Mr. Holden, Fletcher's voice had changed completely. The caution was still there, but something else had surfaced. I have been waiting for this call for 8 months. You knew. I suspected. I have 40 pages of notes. Dax exhaled slowly. The first full breath in what felt like a very long time. Give me 48 hours, Fletcher said. And Mr. Holden, do not go anywhere near Stuart or the Holden building before I tell you it is time. The legal architecture has to be in place before you move, or he runs and we lose him. Do you understand me? Through the hospital window, the waiting room was visible. Clara's small form in the plastic chair, her head tipped sideways in the sleep of sheer exhaustion. 48 hours, Dax agreed. He went back, he sat down beside Clara. He let her sleep. He looked at the window and thought about Paige, about the door with the dent in the lower panel, about what the next 48 hours were going to require. The tide had come all the way in. He was standing in it now. Fletcher called at the opening of the 43rd hour. The accounts were frozen. The injunction was in place. The fraud division had been briefed. 2 board members who had been uncomfortable with Stuart's management for months had provided sworn statements in exchange for certain assurances about their own positions. It is time, Fletcher said. Dax was already on his way. He went back to Edna's house once before he went to the building. The things he needed were few. The notebook of memory fragments, the old cap Clara had given him against the Arizona sun, the medal he wore around his neck. St. Christopher, patron of travelers worn smooth by years of road miles, until the figure on it was almost featureless. Clara met him at the door. She had known before he arrived. She always knew. She let him in. He gathered what he had. He sat at the kitchen table and she sat across from him and they looked at each other across the surface of it. You are leaving tonight, she said. Yes. And then you are coming back. Yes. She looked at the medal around his neck. He reached up and unclipped it. He held it out across the table. She looked at it for a moment, then reached and took it. She turned it over. The surface worn smooth, the image of the figure in motion, almost entirely rubbed away by years of road, reduced to the essential impression of a person going somewhere. Keep that, he said, until I come back to get it. She closed her fingers around it. Do not take too long, she said. The roof over the back bedroom leaks when it rains. I cannot fix it by myself. He laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that sounds like something being recovered. He stood up and looked around the kitchen one last time. The patched window, the stove that ran on the second burner only, the shelves with their careful inventory of things that needed to last. He walked out into the night. The Holden Ironworks building stood the same as it always had. That was the strange thing. He had expected it to look different somehow, to carry on its glass and steel some evidence of what had been done inside it. Buildings do not know what happens in them. They hold the shape of things and let the content be whatever the people inside decide to make it. Dax stood across the street and looked at the lobby with its chrome and marble, at the windows on the 40th floor. Then he crossed the street and went through the lobby, and the elevator took him up. The doors opened. Stuart Mercer was in the boardroom. Standing at the head of the long table, phone in hand, the posture of a man who has been managing something complicated for a long time and has arrived at the particular tension of a manager who has begun to believe the thing no longer requires managing. He looked at Dax. And Stuart Mercer, who had spent 11 years developing a professional face so practiced, it had become his only face, had nothing. 3 full seconds of nothing. The phone in his hand, the city 40 floors below. The expression of a man who has just seen something that was supposed to be dead walk through a door. Then the machinery kicked back in, the professional recalibration, the settling of features into something controlled. Dax, he said, the measured, slightly warm voice of negotiation. I do not know what you have been told, but... Stop, Dax said. The word was quiet, absolute. The kind of quiet that does not need volume because it comes from a place where everything unnecessary has been removed. Stuart stopped. I remember everything, Dax said. The drink, what was in it, the drive to the landfill, the watch, the phone, the wallet, all of it. He crossed the room to the table he had sat at for 11 years. He set the folder down. The accounts are frozen. The fraud division has your filing history for the past 14 months. Fletcher has 40 pages of documentation that he began compiling 3 months before you started moving money because he suspected before you were finished. Stuart looked at the folder, at Dax, back at the folder. The board members who were not yours have provided statements. Dax continued. The injunction is in place. When the police arrive, which will be in approximately 12 minutes, they will be coming specifically for you. A pause. Lena's attorney will be in contact with mine. I am not interested in that conversation personally. Something moved across Stuart's face. Not guilt. Calculation. The final rotation of a machine looking for any configuration that produces a better outcome. There was none. You were supposed to be dead, Stuart said, not accusing, informational, the way a scientist notes a variable that behaved unexpectedly. I was supposed to be, Dax agreed. Someone found me before I was. He thought of Clara, of 2 small fingers pressed against his neck, checking for a pulse in a landfill in August. I have somewhere I need to be, Dax said. He walked to the door. Dax, Stuart's voice behind him, stripped of the professional layer now, smaller, rawer. We built this together. Dax paused at the door. No, he said. I built it. You were beside me while I did. He looked back one last time. There is a difference. He walked out. The elevator, the lobby, the street, the afternoon sun hitting him full in the face as he came through the glass doors, hot and immediate and entirely real. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building he had spent 15 years constructing and took a breath and let the afternoon in. He had somewhere he needed to be. Paige Holden was in her room when he knocked on the front door of the house in Scottsdale. He had knocked instead of using his key because knocking seemed right. The footsteps inside, the pause before the door opened. She was 15 years old sweatpants and a too large t-shirt, hair in a knot, a pencil behind her ear and a smudge of graphite on her forearm, evidence of something she had been doing before this interruption. She looked at him. Not with anger, not with the performed coldness teenagers deploy to protect themselves from being too obviously glad. Something more complicated than either. The specific, careful openness of a person who has been hurt enough to know that hope is dangerous and has decided to allow some of it anyway, because the alternative requires too much energy to maintain indefinitely. Dad, she whispered. That single syllable contained the weight of everything it had been required to carry in his absence. Every time it had been formed and not said because there was no one present to receive it. Every calculation revised downward until the calculation itself became a kind of armor. He sat on the edge of the front step outside the threshold, letting her control the distance. "Can I come in?" he asked. "I have things to tell you, things you deserve to hear." She stepped back from the door. They sat at the kitchen table and he told her everything. Not the version that protected him, not the version that assigned all responsibility to Stuart and Lena and left him as a bystander in his own failure. The full version. Stuart's betrayal, the drink, the landfill, waking up with nothing, not even his own name, a child finding him in the garbage and choosing against all reasonable self-interest to help, an old woman who had less than almost anyone he had ever met and who had given him the most generous hospitality of his life without being asked and without expecting anything in return. He told her about the garden and the well rope, about the fence and the roof, about coffee in the morning across from a woman who had seen through him immediately and told him the truth about himself without cruelty, about lying on a too small sofa mapping the sounds of a house that was not his and finding that those sounds settled something in him that 15 years of building a company had never touched. He told her about Edna collapsing, about the hospital at midnight, about the watch. "These people," Paige said when he had finished. Her voice was careful, feeling its way through the territory of what he had just described. "This girl and her grandmother, they helped you without knowing anything about you. They helped me," Dax said, "because of who they are, not because of who I was." She was quiet for a long moment. "And who were you?" she asked, not as accusation, genuinely. The question of a person trying to complete a picture they have only had partial access to for their entire life. "I was someone very good at building things," he said, "and not very good at being present for them once they were built." He looked at his hands. "I was someone who stood outside your door a lot without going in." Paige looked at him. At the vest, the scar, the hands that looked different from the hands she remembered marked by different work. "I know," she said, not as recrimination as confirmation. She had been knowing it for years. "I am not going to tell you that I can undo any of that," he said. "I am not going to tell you your mother is a good person because I do not believe that is true, and you deserve honesty from me more than you deserve comfort right now. What I can tell you is that I am here, and I mean to stay." Paige looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and crossed the room and put her arms around him. Not the careful, obligatory hug of a teenager performing a family ritual. The grip of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has found in this moment somewhere safe to put it down. He held her and said nothing. Some things do not require words, and adding words to them would only make them smaller. The Iron Nomads found him 3 days later. He was at the hotel Fletcher had arranged, working through the documentation that the coming weeks were going to require when the message came through the chain of relay that certain communications travel. His brothers had been looking for him since he disappeared. 34 of them, spread across 4 states, had spent 3 weeks working a search that institutions had not bothered to conduct because a missing biker with no dependents on file fell below the threshold of institutional interest. He met them on the highway outside Tucson, the stretch that ran alongside the landfill, and if something was deliberate about that choice of location, he did not feel the need to say so. 34 motorcycles lined up on the shoulder in the late afternoon, their sound dying one by one, the particular silence that follows carrying its own weight in the still air. These were men with their own complicated relationship to the law and to the categories the mainstream world used to sort acceptable from unacceptable. Men who had made choices that put them outside certain lines and who had found in the brotherhood of those choices a loyalty that most of the suited world could not comprehend because they had never needed it. Men who, when one of their own disappeared, did not wait for institutions to decide whether to care. They rode together to the edge of the landfill. 34 men stood looking at it in the late light without speaking. Their road captain beside them, found in the garbage by an 8-year-old girl. Then the road captain said, There are two people I need you to meet." They rode to Edna's street. The sound of 34 motorcycles coming down that street was for everyone within earshot an event. They lined up along the curb and killed their engines, and the neighborhood went quiet in the way it goes quiet when something unusual has arrived, and everyone is making a calculation about whether to investigate. Clara opened the door. She stood on the porch in her bare feet and looked at 34 large men in leather with the inventory of someone making an accurate count. She did not call for Edna. She did not retreat. She stood there and assessed them, and then she looked at Dax, and something moved across her face. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," Dax said. She looked at the 34 men again, with the gravity of a person making a genuine decision. "Are any of you hungry?" she said. To all of them, not to anyone in particular. "We do not have much, but Edna made cornbread this morning, and it is better than anything you have had." There was a silence among 34 men. Someone at the back said quietly, "Yes, ma'am." And then the laughter came, full and real and unguarded, from men who had been carrying weight for 3 weeks and had just been asked about cornbread by an 8-year-old girl. Edna appeared in the doorway behind Clara. She took in 34 men on her street with the equanimity of a woman who has revised her threshold for surprise considerably upward. She looked at Dax. She looked at the men. "If you are eating," she said, "you are washing up after yourselves. I have one kitchen, and I just had heart surgery." 34 men agreed that this was entirely reasonable. The laughter that followed was different from the first kind. Warmer, the laughter of men who have been recognized as the people they are rather than the people they appear to be, and who find that recognition unexpectedly welcome. It was not the last time they came. Over the years that followed, the Iron Nomads developed a habit of passing through Tucson, and when they did, they stopped. They stopped because certain places pull you back, not through obligation, but through the particular gravity of places where you have been seen correctly. The legal reconstruction of Holden Ironworks took 8 months. Stuart Mercer was convicted on 6 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and financial crimes. Lena settled in a divorce proceeding that required the return of transferred assets. The board was restructured. Fletcher was brought back as general counsel, a position he accepted without flourish, and with the quiet satisfaction of a man given back the work he should not have lost. Dax rebuilt the company differently from the inside out. Not smaller, not less ambitious. Different in its orientation. Turned to face something it had been pointing away from for 15 years. Affordable housing development in the communities the development sector had concluded were not financially interesting enough to bother with. Infrastructure projects that employed people from the places the projects were built in. Construction contracts structured on the principle that the best thing you can do for a community is make it the agent of its own improvement rather than the object of someone else's charity. The principle turned out to be correct in the ways that mattered. Paige joined the company 4 years later after architecture school. Her portfolio contained student work that her professors had described with the particular reluctant admiration people produce when they are trying not to overstate how good something is. Her first project for Holden Ironworks was an expansion of the building that had been Edna's house, which Clara had decided should become a community health clinic because the neighborhood needed one, and the building was there, and the need was not going to wait for a more convenient moment. The expansion doubled the clinic's floor space and added a courtyard where the garden had been. The garden was still there, still tended, but by the community, now by the people who came to the clinic and stayed to help maintain what they found there. Paige designed the courtyard around the original plantings, the mint, the tomatoes, the plants that mattered most, the ones that were there when everything else ran out. Clara became a doctor. No one who had watched her move through the landfill with the focused attention of a person who finds value where other people see waste was remotely surprised by what she became. She completed medical school and a residency in family medicine and returned to practice at the clinic that now bore her grandmother's name. She was not yet 30, and she was, by the assessment of her patients and her staff, and anyone who spent time in her presence, precisely what Edna Briggs had been. Someone who saw clearly, judged carefully, gave fully, and expected very little in return. Edna lived to see her graduate. She arrived at the graduation ceremony in an ambulance because her heart had been declining for 2 years, and the cardiologist had been clear that travel of this kind was not advisable. Edna had considered this advice with all the respect it deserved and had arranged the ambulance. She sat in the front row in the dark blue dress that Clara had said made her look like someone who had always worn dark blue dresses. When Clara crossed the stage to receive her degree, Edna raised one hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, unhurried, complete, not wavering. The full stop of a gesture from a woman who had never made a gesture that did not mean exactly what it looked like. Clara found her eyes across the crowd and smiled. It was enough. Edna Briggs died 6 weeks later, in her sleep, in the room that had been hers for 43 years. Clara found her in the morning, and the light through the window that Paige had enlarged during the renovation was, Clara said afterward, the kind of light that a person would choose if they were choosing, and maybe Edna had been choosing in whatever the last way of choosing is. The grief was the kind that reshapes a person permanently. That hollows something out which does not fill back in, but becomes part of the interior architecture, a space you learn to live around without losing it. Clara carried it the way she carried everything, not because she was not feeling it, but because she had learned from the person who caused it, how to feel things fully and continue functioning, how to grieve with your whole self while your whole self remains standing. The memorial drew people from both sides of the city. The neighbors who had watched Edna's porch for decades and understood, without it ever being stated, that she was the axis around which the block oriented itself. The clinic's patients and staff. Men in leather who stood at the back with their arms folded and their faces carrying things they did not have the language for. Paige, who stood at the front because she had been coming to this house since she was 15 and had decided somewhere in the second or third visit that Edna Briggs was the adult she intended to become. Fletcher, who had met Edna once and had apparently found that once sufficient. Dax stood at the graveside and said 3 sentences. He had written more. He had tried a page, then 2, and thrown them away because they were not the right thing, and no amount of revision would make them the right thing. 3 sentences were right. She pulled me out of the garbage, not just the landfill, every part of me that had forgotten what it was for. He stepped back. Clara took his arm. Paige was on his other side. The 34 men stood in a row behind him. The sun was at the angle it gets in Arizona in October, coming in slanted and golden, catching every face assembled and illuminating them the way certain light illuminates things. Not harshly, honestly. That was Edna's last gift to the people she had pulled out of various forms of garbage. She had always seen them as the people they were still in the process of becoming. Not the people they had been when she found them. Not the people the world had decided they were. The people they were still becoming. And the difference, it turned out, was everything. Years passed. They passed the way good years pass when you are using them correctly. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the texture of time that has been given something real to fill it. Holden Ironworks grew. The clinic grew. Paige's work became something recognized by people whose recognition meant something. Clara, at 32, married a physician she had met in residency, a quiet and funny man who had the specific quality of being able to sit in a room with Clara and not feel the need to fill the silence she created. Dax attended the wedding in a suit that almost fit. He danced with Clara at the reception, and Clara directed his arms to the correct positions with the same patient authority she had directed him at the well years before, and the dance was improved by the intervention. Paige produced a daughter. She arrived at Dax's house with the baby and said her name is Rosie Clara, and she is named for 2 women without whom none of us would be here. And the expression on Dax's face when she said it was something Paige kept in the particular collection of images she returned to when she needed to remember what things were actually for. Rosie Clara Holden grew the way children grow when they are raised correctly. Fast in some ways and slow in others, with the specific unpredictability of a person whose character is entirely her own, even when it contains pieces of the people who came before her. She had Paige's precision and Clara's directness, and something else, some quality of noticing, of seeing, that made people in her presence feel recognized in ways they could not entirely account for. She was 5 years old when Dax took her to the park. The landfill had been closed 8 years before. A combination of environmental regulation and community advocacy, and the specific influence of a company that had been consistently telling the city what was possible when you decided to build something that lasted. The land had been remediated over 3 years and seeded and planted until what had been a mountain of discarded things was now grass and walking paths and a playground in the eastern corner, and trees that had been young when planted and now cast real shade. It was a warm October afternoon. The October light in Arizona is different from the summer light, less vertical, more golden, coming in at an angle that is almost generous in the way it falls on things. Rosie Clara walked with her hand in his and talked the way 5-year-olds talk, without pause, without filter, with the full investment of someone who has not yet learned to perform detachment. She wanted to know about the birds in the trees, which he told her were cactus wrens. She wanted to know about the old man on the bench by the water feature, who he told her was someone who came every day because his doctor had recommended walking, and he had decided that walking somewhere specific was better than walking nowhere in particular. She wanted to know why the grass in the eastern section was darker green than the rest. He told her that the eastern section had been the most active part of the landfill, which meant the soil there, even after remediation, retained more organic material than the surrounding area, which plants tended to find beneficial. She filed this away with the expression of someone adding a piece of information to a collection she intended to keep. They walked to the center of the park, to the place that had been once the densest part of the debris field. The place where a foot had caught on something that was not metal and an 8-year-old girl had stopped instead of continuing. Dax stopped walking. He looked at the grass under his feet, at the trees, at the joggers on the path, the path to the south, and the dog walkers and the children on the playground in the distance, and the October sky over all of it. He looked at what this place had become. Grandpa, Rosie Clara was looking up at him. Yes, is this where they found you, where Clara found you? Right here, he said, right where we are standing. She looked at the grass with the serious, concentrated attention of a 5-year-old trying to reconcile what she knows with what she can see. The joggers, the trees, the children, her own feet on the grass. You were lucky, she said finally. He looked down at her, at this small person who existed because a chain of improbable things had begun on an afternoon in August, with a girl walking through garbage and making a choice that nothing in her situation required her to make. Yes, he said. She waited. She was already very good at waiting, at sensing when a person is not finished. But not for the reason you would think, he said. What is the reason? He was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the park, the particular October wind that carries in it the first real suggestion of cool. The trees moved. The jogger on the southern path went past. The luck was not surviving, he said. The luck was who found me. Rosie Clara turned the idea over. The small working of her face that happened when she was processing something she understood was important before she fully understood it. Clara, she said, she found you. Clara and her grandmother, he said, both of them. She nodded, added it to the collection. Then she squeezed his hand and pulled him toward the playground with the decisive energy of a 5-year-old who has given a serious thing the serious consideration it deserves and is now ready for the climbing structure. And Dax Holden, who had been left for dead in the place where they were standing by the people who were supposed to be closest to him, and who had been found and saved and rebuilt by the people who had the least power and the most to give, followed his granddaughter across the grass toward the afternoon. She ran ahead of him when they reached the structure. Ran without looking back, certain of being followed, certain of being watched. The particular certainty of a child who has never had reason to look over her shoulder. He watched her climb. He stood in the park that had been the landfill, and he watched his granddaughter climb the structure that his daughter had designed, and he thought about an afternoon in August and a girl with a canvas bag and bare feet and 2 fingers pressed to his neck. He thought about what Clara had said the first time he was conscious enough to hear her. Not who are you, not what do you have, not what makes you worth helping. Just this delivered in the calm, unhurried voice of a person who has already made the only decision that matters. It does not matter who you are right now. What matters is that we move. The most important thing a person can learn is the difference between what they have accumulated and what they are. He had accumulated an empire. He had learned face down in the garbage that the empire was not him, that underneath it, underneath the title and the money and the reputation and the partnerships and all of it, there was something that had nothing to do with any of those things. Something that did not need a name to know what it was for. Clara had seen it when there was nothing else left to see. Edna had confirmed it every morning she refilled his coffee without being asked. That was the luck, not the survival, the seeing. There is a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with what you own. It lives in the texture of the days, in the sound a house makes when the people inside it are at ease, in the feeling of a rope coming up right when you have stopped fighting it, in the weight of a small medal in the hand of a child who has earned the responsibility of keeping it safe. Rosie Clara reached the top of the climbing structure. She stood at the highest point and looked out over the park with the surveying expression of a 5-year-old who has made it somewhere and intends to take in the view. She found him in the space below. She raised one hand, slow, deliberate, the same gesture exactly that he had seen in the front row of a medical school graduation 7 years before. Not performed, not hurried, complete. He raised his. Some things do not require more than that. The landfill was a park now. The cactus wrens called from the eastern section, from the dark green grass above the rich soil. The playground was full. The October light came through the trees in bars of gold. Rosie Clara climbed down from the structure and came back to him at a run, her arms out for balance on the uneven ground, her face entirely open. He caught her hand when she reached him. They walked together back across the grass toward the gate, toward the car, toward the ordinary afternoon that was waiting for them on the other side of it, full of the texture of time, being properly used, of days, given something real to fill them. He had nowhere else to be. He had everything he had been built to have. He had arrived. There are things that do not get said in the moment they should be said. Not because the moment is wrong or the people in it are wrong, but because the words have not yet been assembled into the shape that the moment requires. They come later in the car, on the way home, or in the dark before sleep, or years afterward, when you are standing somewhere and the light is at a particular angle, and the assembled weight of what you did not say arrives all at once with a clarity that the original moment, for all its urgency, could not have contained. Dax had not said, when he left Edna's house the final time, what he had wanted to say. He had not said it to Edna, and he had not said it to Clara, because neither of them would have wanted to hear it in those terms, and he had understood that intuitively even then. The thing he had wanted to say was something about what they had done to him. Not the practical rescue, not the food and the shelter and the lie told to dangerous men on a quiet street. The other thing, the thing underneath all of that. He had come to them broken in a way that had nothing to do with the wound on his head. He had come to them as a man who had spent 15 years building something and had forgotten in the building of it what he was building it for, who had accumulated everything and arrived at the end of the accumulation at a landfill, which was not a metaphor, but which functioned as one with a completeness that no deliberate metaphor could match. He had come to them empty in the specific way that men who have poured everything into the wrong containers become empty, not lacking things, lacking what the things were supposed to point toward. And they had filled him back up, not with anything you could inventory, with the weight of a rope coming upright, with the sound of a house at night that is at peace with itself, with the particular morning quality of coffee made by someone who makes it the same way every morning, because the constancy is part of what the coffee is. With the sight of a child moving through a garden she has tended long enough to feel responsible for. With the plain, unhurried truth-telling of a woman who has decided that the only respect worth giving another person is the respect of not lying to them, even when lying would be easier for both parties. That was what he had not said. He had not said it because there was no way to say it that did not sound like something other than what it was. Like gratitude in the small sense, the transactional sense, the sense that assumes a ledger and implies that the debt can be squared if you throw enough money at it. It was not that, it was larger than that and less reducible, and it could not be said in words without losing something essential in the translation. He had understood this standing at Edna's kitchen table with the medal in his hand, and he had done what you do with things that cannot be translated into words. He had put the medal in Clara's hand, and he had looked at her, and she had looked back at him, and she had understood, with the complete, uncomplicated accuracy of a person who has never needed words for the things that actually matter. That was enough. The years after the reconstruction were not without difficulty. Dax had not expected them to be without difficulty. He had not, in those first weeks of putting the company back together, made the mistake of believing that reversing what Stewart had done would restore what existed before. What existed before was gone. Not destroyed exactly, transformed. The company that came back was built on different foundations and faced different directions, and was not the same entity as the one that had existed in the boardroom on the 40th floor, where the scotch with the bitter undertaste had been handed across the table. It was better. Dax knew that without sentimentality, the way you know things that are simply true. The first version had been built to satisfy the internal logic of a man who needed to prove something to himself and had never entirely examined what the proving was for. The second version was built to do something specific in the world that needed doing, which was a more durable kind of ambition. The affordable housing projects took longer and cost more than the projections said they would, which is the nature of projections about things that have not been done in a particular way before. There were municipal negotiations that required patience of the kind that Dax had not previously cultivated, the patience of someone who cannot simply push harder when resistance is encountered, but must find the specific shape that fits the opening. There were partnerships with community organizations that had learned over decades of experience with developers to be suspicious of intentions until the intentions demonstrated themselves through behavior over time. And Dax did not object to being required to demonstrate. He demonstrated. Fletcher managed the legal architecture of the reconstruction with the quiet satisfaction of a man doing work he was built for in a context that justified it. He never mentioned the 8 months of waiting. He never brought up the notes he had kept. He filed them away somewhere and got on with the work, which was Dax suspected what Fletcher had always preferred to retrospective accounting. Paige came into the company the way she came into everything, with a clear idea of what she was there to do, in the particular focused confidence of someone who has spent enough time being uncertain that they have learned to distinguish clearly between genuine uncertainty and the performed uncertainty that other people find less threatening. She did not perform uncertainty. She made decisions. She justified them when asked. She revised them when the evidence required revision and not before. Her relationship with Clara had been established on the afternoon of the first visit, when Clara had told her to take her shoes off, and Paige had done it, and the foundation that was poured in that moment held everything that came after. They were not the same. They had grown up in completely different worlds and carried completely different scar tissue from the growing. But they recognized each other in the specific way that people recognize other people who have learned to pay accurate attention to the world, rather than the world they would prefer. Clara recognized most people. It was her professional gift and her personal one. She sat with patients in the clinic that bore her grandmother's name, and she looked at them with the same eyes she had always had, the eyes that did not flinch and did not condescend and did not move past what was actually there toward what it would be easier to see. She was not gentle in the soft focus sense. She was precise, and her precision was itself a form of care, the care of a person who takes your situation seriously enough to see it accurately rather than consolingly. The clinic grew because the neighborhood needed it to grow, and Clara did not require more justification than that. Dax came every week. He sat in the waiting room sometimes just to sit there, to be in the presence of what had grown from an afternoon in August, from a foot catching on something that was not metal, from the specific chain of consequence that had been set in motion by a child who looked at a man in the garbage and decided he was worth stopping for. He did not always announce himself. Sometimes he arrived when Clara was with a patient, and he sat with the other people in the waiting room chairs, and he drank the bad coffee from the machine in the corner, and he watched people come and go through the door with the look on their faces that people have when they are about to ask for help. He knew that look. He had worn it himself under different circumstances in a landfill in August. He knew what it cost a person to be in a place where they needed something they could not provide for themselves. And he knew, because he had been on the receiving end of it, what it meant when the help that came was given without the implicit cost of condescension or the implicit debt of gratitude. He tried to give it that way. He did not always succeed. He was aware that he did not always succeed. But he tried, and trying with consistency over a long time produces a different kind of person than the person who does not try, and Dax had enough years left in him to let the trying do its work. Paige's daughter, Rosie Clara, became the embodiment of all of it, in the way that children born into the aftermath of things become embodiments of them, not carrying the weight of what came before, but carrying the fruit of it. She was from very early the kind of child who notices, who pays attention, not because she has been told to pay attention, but because paying attention is what the world seems to require of her, the natural posture of a person who is absorbed from the people around her, the principle that seeing things accurately is not optional, but foundational. She visited the clinic every week with her grandmother Edna's name on the sign above the door, and she asked questions the way children ask questions, without the social filtering that adults apply to questions about why things are the way they are and whether they need to be that way. Clara answered the questions directly because Clara did not possess a switch for condescension and would not have used it if she had. She visited the Iron Nomads when they came through Tucson, and she stood among 34 large men in leather with the complete comfort of a child who has been taught by example and by accumulation that the category of people worth caring about is not defined by how they look or what they have or where they have been, but by what they are when something is asked of them. She loved the garden at the clinic. The one Paige had designed around the original plantings, the mint and the tomatoes and the plants that mattered most. She knew the names of things in it, which she had learned from Clara, and the properties of those things, which she had also learned from Clara, and the principle that a garden is a relationship rather than an acquisition, which she had apparently derived on her own from watching how Clara moved through it. The afternoon in the park was not the last conversation Dax had with her about what had happened in the landfill, but it was the first time she had asked directly, and the directness of it had required a directness in return that he had not previously articulated even to himself. The luck was not surviving. The luck was who found me. He turned that over in the months after the way you turn things over when they have been said, and the saying of them revealed something you had known but had not previously stated. The luck was not the biological fact of the pulse Clara found under two small fingers in August. The pulse was luck of the ordinary kind, the luck of timing, of not having been there long enough for the heat and the dehydration and the head wound to take the outcome past the point of recovery. The other luck was different in kind. The luck of being found by someone who looked at a large, unconscious man in a landfill covered in blood and wearing the patches of a motorcycle club and heard the sound he made, the sound that was not a threat but a plea, and stayed. The luck of being brought to a house presided over by a woman who assessed the situation with the clear eyes of someone who has learned that you cannot afford to see things as other than they are, and who offered the first of many refilled cups without being asked. The luck of being told the truth about yourself by people who did not need anything from you and therefore had no reason to tell you anything but the truth. That was the luck that mattered. That was the luck that changed things. He had thought about this enough over enough years to know that what Clara and Edna had given him was not something he could replicate exactly because it had come from who they were and what they had built together and the specific circumstances that had made him available to receive it. You cannot engineer that kind of encounter. You cannot create the conditions for it or schedule it or produce it through intention. What you can do is try to be the kind of person who is capable of giving it when the opportunity arrives unannounced, which is the only way it ever arrives. He tried to be that person. Over the years, he tried. In the clinic waiting room with bad coffee, and in the boardroom with Fletcher, and in the conversation with Paige that had happened at the kitchen table of a house in Scottsdale, and in the relationship with his granddaughter that had been built on the foundation of all the preceding things. You do not always know when you are the person found in the landfill and when you are the person doing the finding. Most of the time, you are both at once found by some things and doing the finding for others. And the trick, if there is one, is to stay available for both, to not close yourself off from either direction, to remain as Edna had been and as Clara was the kind of person who hears the sound beneath the surface and stays. The October light in the park moved through the afternoon. The cactus wrens called. Rosie Clara came back to him from the climbing structure at a run, and he caught her hand, and they walked together toward the gate. He did not look back at the place where it had all begun. He did not need to. He carried it with him the way you carry everything that has become part of your interior architecture, not as weight but as foundation. The ground beneath every step he had taken in the years since an 8-year-old girl had crouched beside him in the garbage and pressed 2 fingers to his neck and waited. There, faint but present, he had been found. He had been rebuilt. He had tried in the years since to deserve it. Whether he had succeeded was not something he could determine from inside his own perspective. But he had tried with consistency and intention and the specific kind of humility that comes from knowing without ambiguity exactly where you were when the thing that changed you found you. In a landfill in August in the city of Tucson, face down in the garbage, waiting without knowing he was waiting for someone to stop. He had found in the years since that this was not a story about rescue. Not exactly. It was a story about recognition, about the specific act of seeing something in a person when there is no practical reason to look closely, when looking closely costs you and gains you nothing when the world around you is actively providing reasons to keep moving and not stop. Clara had stopped. Edna had opened the door. And what grew from the stopping and the opening was everything that came after. You cannot engineer it. You cannot schedule it. You can only try to be the kind of person who stops when the situation asks you to stop, who opens when the situation asks you to open, who gives what is needed without keeping an account of the giving. That was all. That was Dax's thought, walking through the October afternoon with his granddaughter's hand in his everything. The gate of the park opened outward. He pushed through it. Rosie Clara went first, already looking ahead toward the car, toward the rest of the afternoon, toward whatever came next in the infinite chain of ordinary moments that make up the life a person is actually living when they are not thinking about which moments will matter. He followed her. Behind them, the park held what it had always held: the grass and the trees and the pathways and the light and the particular gravity of a place where something had happened that required everything that followed. The cactus wrens called. The afternoon continued. The city went on being the city. It was full of its ordinary problems and its ordinary graces, and the uncountable number of moments in which a person makes or fails to make the choice to stop. He had been on both sides of that choice. He knew what it weighed. He knew what it gave. He did not intend to forget. There is a photograph on the wall of the clinic named for Edna Briggs, in the corridor between the waiting room and the examination rooms, at the height that people's eyes naturally land when they are walking that corridor and not thinking about where they are looking. It is not a formal photograph. Formal photographs have a particular quality of arrangement to them, a particular quality of everyone knowing they are being photographed, which changes the faces and the postures and the quality of the light in subtle ways that distinguish them from photographs taken when no one has arranged themselves for the camera. This one is not like that. It was taken on an afternoon in October, years after the day in the park, by a nurse named Sandra, who had her phone out for another reason entirely and had seen something in the corridor that made her stop. Clara was walking toward the camera. She was wearing her white coat, and she had a patient chart in one hand, and she was looking slightly to the left of the lens, something or someone outside the frame, and the expression on her face was the expression of a person who is entirely, completely present in the moment they are in. Not performing presence, not managing the performance of a professional who is trained to project engagement. Simply present. The way Edna had been present in every room she entered, in every conversation she participated in every cup of coffee she set in front of a stranger without being asked. Clara had looked at the photograph when Sandra put it on the wall, and she had stood in front of it for a long moment, and then she had said quietly to no one in particular, "She looks like Edna." And the nurse Sandra, who had not known Edna Briggs, but who had heard the story the way everyone who worked in the clinic had heard the story in pieces from different people over time, said, "I know. That is why I put it there." Dax had seen the photograph on one of his weekly visits. He had stood in front of it the way Clara had stood in front of it for a long moment, and he had thought about the specific way that certain people transmit themselves. Not through genetics, which is one method and operates on its own rules. Through something harder to name and more durable in the right conditions. Through the accumulation of small decisions made consistently over time, decisions about what to give and what to withhold and what to say and what to leave to silence and what to see and what to look past. Edna had made those decisions consistently for 73 years. Clara had absorbed them the way children absorb the things that are practiced around them, through repetition and proximity, and the particular osmosis of living closely with someone whose character is a fact of the environment. And now Clara made them in turn consistently in the rooms of a clinic named for the woman who had made them before her. The photograph was of Clara, but anyone who had known Edna recognized the thing in it that was hers. Rosie Clara, at 9, had a particular relationship with the photograph. She stopped in front of it every time she visited the clinic, which was often, and she looked at it with the particular focused attention she brought to things she was still working out. She never said what she was working out. She simply stopped and looked and then continued down the corridor. Clara had told Dax about this one evening, sitting in the garden of the clinic after the last patient had left with 2 cups of tea that had gone slightly cold while they talked. "She does not ask about the photograph," Clara said. She just stops in front of it. She is learning something, Dax said. I think so. Clara turned her cup. I think she is working out whether what she sees in it is something that can be passed down or whether it was specific to Edna. Dax was quiet for a moment. What do you think, he asked? Clara looked at him. The evening light in the garden did what October light does in Arizona, came in at the angle that caught everything and made it briefly exact. I think, she said carefully, that it is both. I think it was specific to Edna, and I think it can also be passed down. I think those are not contradictory things. He thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it when Rosie Clara at 10 came to him with a question about a girl at school who had been left at the playground at the end of the day and whose parents had not come and who was sitting alone on the swing while everyone else left. She wanted to know what she should do. He told her what Clara had once told him without knowing he was quoting it. It doesn't matter who you are right now. What matters is we move. Rosie Clara had looked at him with the expression of a child who has received information she intends to keep. Then she went back to the playground and sat on the swing beside the girl and waited with her until the parents finally came, and the girl, who would not have known what any of this meant in terms of what had preceded it and what would follow it, had looked at Rosie Clara the way certain people look at other people when they understand without language that the person beside them is someone who stopped. That was it. That was the whole of it. To stop, to see, to give what is needed without keeping an account. It was the simplest thing in the world and the hardest, and Edna Briggs had done it every day of her 73 years. And Clara did it every day in the clinic named for her and Rosie. Clara was learning in the specific way that things worth learning are learned by watching and by practice and by the accumulation of small decisions that over time become the person you are. The landfill was a park. The house was a clinic. The girl who had found a man in the garbage was a doctor. The man who had been found was the person the finding had made possible. The granddaughter of the finding was 9 years old and learning how to stop. And somewhere in the arithmetic of all of this was Edna Briggs, who had refilled a cup of coffee without being asked and told an inconvenient truth without cruelty and opened a door to a stranger in the dark and bought a man time with nothing but her age and her composure and the conviction that this was simply what you did when the situation required it. She had not thought of herself as doing anything remarkable. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. She had thought of it as simply what a person of her kind did when the situation was what it was. She had not kept a record of the giving. She had not expected the gift to be returned, though it had been returned in ways she could not have anticipated through a chain of consequence that extended beyond her life and would extend beyond the lives of everyone who had been touched by it in ways none of them would be alive to see. That is what it means to do the right thing at the right moment. Not that you see the consequences, not that you benefit from them or witness them or receive confirmation that the investment has paid off. Just that you do the thing the moment requires and trust that moments are not isolated, that every moment is connected to every other moment. That what you do in the moment you are in moves through the world in ways that cannot be predicted or tracked or measured from inside the moment itself. Edna had trusted this. She had lived as though it were true. And it was true in the way that things that are deeply true tend not to announce themselves, but to simply be quietly without the fanfare that less true things tend to require. The afternoon in the park ended the way afternoons end. The light shifted. The air cooled slightly in the way the October air cools when the sun begins to lose its angle. Rosie Clara grew tired in the specific way of children who have been entirely present for the whole of an afternoon and have left nothing in reserve, which is the only way children know how to be tired. Dax carried her the last part of the way to the car. She leaned her head against his shoulder and was asleep before he had the door open, the deep, immediate sleep of someone who has used everything the day had to offer. He strapped her in. He looked at her face in the last of the afternoon light, the specific restfulness of a child who does not yet know enough about the world to be afraid of it when their guard is down. He thought about the first time Clara had looked at him in the landfill, 8 years old, serious, taking accurate measure of what she was seeing and deciding what to do with it. He thought about the way she had pressed 2 fingers to his neck, patient and careful, waiting for the pulse that was there. He thought about what it had meant that it was there. He closed the car door softly. He walked around to the driver's side. He did not look back at the park. He did not need to. What the park represented was not located there anymore. It was distributed through every person the afternoon had touched, and every person those people had touched, and every person who had been told the story in pieces from different angles over time. It was in the clinic. It was in the walls of houses that had been built by Holden Ironworks in neighborhoods that had not expected anyone to build them. It was in Fletcher's office where 40 pages of notes had been waiting for 8 months. It was in the front row of a medical school graduation ceremony where a woman had raised one hand slowly and deliberately and made a gesture complete. It was in Rosie Clara asleep in the back seat carrying it forward into a future that none of them would see the whole of. Dax started the car. The city moved past the windows on the way home, the late afternoon light catching the surfaces of things and giving them back clearly the way October light does without the heat haze of summer, without the refraction that makes edges uncertain. The cactus wrens were still calling when he pulled out of the park's parking lot. He could hear them through the window he had left cracked. He drove. Rosie Clara slept. The city continued being the city. It was full of its ordinary problems and its ordinary graces, full of the uncountable small moments in which people decided whether to stop or to keep moving, to see or to look past, to give or to withhold. He was not the same man who had been left in the landfill. He was the man the landfill and what came after it had made possible. He drove home with his granddaughter asleep in the back seat, the evening coming on around them, and the road ahead entirely clear. The night Edna came home from the hospital 3 weeks after the surgery, the street outside her house was different than it had ever been. Dax had not arranged it. He had told the road captain when he was expected to arrive with Edna, and that information had moved through the channels it moved through, and what arrived on the street at the hour of Edna's homecoming were 22 iron nomads lined up along the curb with their bikes off and their helmets in their hands. Not a ceremony, not a procession. They were simply there the way they were there for things that mattered in the specific quiet of people who have learned that presence is often the most accurate form of respect. Edna came home in the front seat of Dax's borrowed truck, moving carefully because her chest still ached at certain angles, and when she saw what was on the street, she looked at it for a long moment without speaking. 22 large men, lined up along the curb, helmets in their hands, saying nothing, doing nothing, simply present. She looked at Dax. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I did not do it," he said. "They came." She looked at the men again. Then she looked at the house. The garden through the side gate, the mint and the tomatoes and the plants that mattered most. The repaired porch step, the window with the crack held together by tape that he had been meaning to properly fix for weeks and had not yet gotten to. She looked at all of it with the eyes of a woman returning to a place she had not been certain she would return to, seeing it with the specific attention of someone who has had occasion to recalibrate what familiar things are worth. "Well," she said, and her voice was the voice it had always been, the voice that required no elevation to be heard. "Help me out of this truck. I am not going to sit here while 22 grown men watch me try to manage a truck door." Dax helped her out of the truck. Clara was waiting on the porch. She had been waiting since noon, which was 3 hours before Edna was scheduled to arrive, because waiting on the porch was a more useful occupation than the various alternatives. Edna made it up the porch steps without assistance, which she had informed Dax in the truck she intended to do, and the look on her face when she reached the top step was not triumph, but something more measured. The acknowledgement of a body that has been through something significant and has not emerged unchanged. Clara held the door open. Edna went inside. The 22 men on the street waited until the door closed. Then they put their helmets back on. Then they rode away one by one, the sound of the engines diminishing down the street and around the corner until the neighborhood was quiet again. Clara told Dax about this later, what it had looked like from inside the house. The sound of them arriving, the silence while Edna came home, the sound of them leaving. She said it had sounded like something punctuating itself, like a sentence that knew where to put the period. She was right, it did. In the weeks that followed Edna's homecoming, the house settled into a new rhythm. Clara was there more, which she would have been regardless, but the visit schedule became more regular, more intentional. Dax came twice a week. He did the heavier things that Edna could not yet do without straying the water, the garden work, the maintenance that the house required. Clara came in the evenings and sat with her grandmother, and they talked the way they had always talked, in the particular way of people who have known each other so completely that they do not need to explain the context of anything, every conversation already embedded in the full shared history of everything they have been through together. Edna was not diminished by what had happened to her. She was different. The surgery had taken something away, in the physical sense, had removed a piece of the mechanism and repaired it and put it back. And the repaired version functioned but differently, with a slight change in rhythm that was perceptible to anyone who paid close attention. Edna paid close attention to everything, including herself, and so she was aware of the change without being troubled by it. She had always understood that the body changes over time, and that the person inside it changes too, and that the relationship between them is an ongoing negotiation rather than a fixed arrangement. She was slower. She rested in the afternoons now, which she had not done before. She tired more easily, which she accepted as information rather than defeat. She was in the ways that mattered exactly the same. She still made coffee the same way. She still sat in the chair by the window in the evenings with whatever book had come from the library. She still told the truth without cruelty and saw past surfaces to what was actually there, and made her decisions about what to give and what to withhold with the clear, unhurried authority of a woman who had been making those decisions for decades and had long since stopped second-guessing her own judgment. She still, on the days when Dax came, refilled his cup without being asked. He had tried once to say something about this, to acknowledge what it meant. He had chosen a morning when Clara was not there, when it was just the two of them at the kitchen table, the coffee between them and the morning light coming through the eastern window. He had started 3 different sentences and finished none of them. Each time he got partway through the structure of what he was trying to say, he found that the words were inadequate to the thing he was trying to say, that they reduced it in the saying, made it smaller and more transactional than it was. Edna watched him try and fail 3 times. Then she set her cup down. "You do not need to say it," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I have always known. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. If they need to be said, they usually have not yet been understood." He thought about this for a long time. He thought about it at the company when he was in meetings about the housing projects and needed to remember why the housing projects mattered. He thought about it at the clinic when he was in the waiting room with bad coffee and watching people come through the door with the look of people about to ask for help. He thought about it at home late when the city was quiet and he was sitting with everything that the years had accumulated and trying to hold it at the right distance, close enough to feel but far enough to see clearly. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. If they need to be said, they usually have not yet been understood. Edna had understood from the beginning what she was doing when she cleaned his wound and refilled his coffee and lied to dangerous men on a quiet street. She had not needed to articulate it because she was operating from a level of understanding that was below articulation, that had been reached through the accumulation of a lifetime of decisions made consistently in the direction of what a person of her kind did when the situation was what it was. He had been slower to understand. He had needed the landfill. He had needed the weeks in the small house. He had needed the rope in the fence and the garden and the sound of the house at night. He had needed to sell the watch. He had needed the hospital at midnight and the dawn when the surgeon said stable and Paige's arms around him at the kitchen table in Scottsdale. He had needed all of it to arrive at an understanding that Edna had apparently been born with, or had arrived at so early that the arrival itself was not something she remembered anymore. He did not begrudge himself the slowness. The slowness had been necessary because he was the person he was, had been built the way he had been built, had made the choices he had made, had needed to arrive at the landfill before he could understand what the landfill was for. But he was grateful that the understanding had arrived, and he was grateful that it had arrived in time to do something with it. This was not a small thing. There are men who arrive at understanding too late, who sit with what they have finally grasped in the full knowledge that the time for acting on it has passed. Dax had arrived in time, barely in some respects, but in time. He had arrived in time to know Paige, in time to see her become the architect she had been in the process of becoming, regardless of whether he was there to see it. In time to be present for Rosie Clara in the ways he had not been present for Paige, with the specific attention of someone who has learned that presence is not incidental to the relationship, but is the relationship, that the door you open is the door that matters, and the door you stand outside of is the door that stays closed. He had arrived in time to sit with Edna through the years that followed the surgery, the years in which she moved more slowly and rested in the afternoons, and continued with total consistency to be exactly who she had always been. He had arrived in time to be at the graduation in the front row when she raised her hand. He had arrived in time to stand at the graveside and say 3 sentences that were the right sentences because they were the only ones that fit. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the accounting of a life, which is the only accounting that ultimately matters, exactly sufficient. Dax Holden had been left for dead in a landfill by the people he had trusted most. He had been found by the people who had the least reason to stop and stop anyway. He had been rebuilt, not restored, rebuilt into something different from and better than what had been broken. He had spent the years since trying to deserve the finding. He thought he had made some progress. He was not finished. He drove home through the city, with Rosie Clara asleep in the back seat, and the evening coming on around him and the road ahead clear. The way roads are clear when you know where you are going and are not confused about why. He was not finished. He was a man who had been found. He was a man who had learned from being found how to stop. He intended to keep stopping for as long as he had the ability to stop for as many people as the world continued to place in his path who needed someone to see them and stay. That was the vow, not the one he had made in the dark in the small house listening to the 2 people sleeping behind the curtain. That had been a vow about protection, about not letting harm come to the 2 people who had kept harm from coming to him. This was older than that. This was the vow that the finding had revealed that had been there all along underneath the empire and the accumulation and the long table and the swisel that meant something else. The vow that the landfill had exposed by removing everything that was covering it. He was not finished. The road continued. The cactus wrens were still calling somewhere behind him from the dark green grass above the rich soil, from the place where the old landfill had become a park, and the park had become the place where a man had told his granddaughter the truth about luck. He drove. The evening came on. The city held its ordinary problems and its ordinary graces, and the uncountable number of moments in which people made or did not make the choice to stop. He had made that choice. He intended to keep making it. He was in every way that mattered exactly where he was supposed to be. Paige found the notebook years later when she was going through the boxes that had accumulated in the spare room of Dax's house after he moved to the smaller place near the clinic. It was an ordinary spiral-bound notebook, the kind sold in stacks at dollar stores with a cover that had been bent back on itself enough times to have lost its original shape. The pages inside were covered in his handwriting, dense and slightly uneven, written in the dark or the near dark in the small hours of the night. She sat down on the floor of the spare room with the notebook in her lap and read it. It was not a diary. It did not have dates or the narrative structure of a person recording what happened to them. It was something different. A collection of fragments, observations, pieces of things he had been holding and turning over and trying to understand. The writing was interrupted by long blank spaces where the pen had been put down and then picked up again, sometimes mid-sentence, sometimes after what must have been hours. She found the page where he had written her name for the first time, where he had written what he remembered or what he was beginning to remember about the door with a dent in the lower panel, about standing outside it, about not going in. Below that, in different ink in handwriting that was slightly more controlled, as though the pen had been picked up later, and from a different emotional place, I did not deserve her patience. I am trying to earn it now. That is all anyone can do. She sat with that for a while. Then she turned the pages and found the section that was about Clara, about the first morning in the landfill, about the water from the half bottle, about the 2 fingers on his neck, about what he had thought in the moment when he felt the pulse under her hand, the specific thought he had had which he recorded with the direct plainness of someone writing in the dark who has stopped worrying about how things sound. I thought someone came. I thought I am not alone. I thought I did not know until this moment how long I had been alone. She turned more pages. She found the section that was about Edna, about coffee, about the blanket folded with more dignity than the circumstances required, about the lie told to dangerous men on a quiet street, delivered with such complete composure that the men had believed it entirely and walked south toward the rail yard and not come back. Below this, she found a line he had written and then crossed out and then rewritten exactly the same as if the crossing out had been a mistake rather than a revision. She was not afraid of anything. I do not know if she was ever afraid. I think she might have been afraid sometimes and simply did not allow fear to be the deciding factor. That is not the same as not being afraid. That is much better than not being afraid. Paige set the notebook down on the floor of the spare room for a moment. She looked out the window at the garden. The afternoon light was at the angle that she had come to associate with certain conversations, certain arrivals, certain moments of the kind that accumulate over a life and become the life itself. She picked the notebook back up. Near the end, in the most recent handwriting, she found a page that was different from the others. It was a list. Not a list of things to do or things to acquire. A list of names. Just names a line apiece with nothing written after them. Clara, Edna, Paige, Fletcher. 34 iron nomads listed individually by their road names, names she recognized from years of Sunday dinners and detours through Tucson. And at the end, the most recent added in ink that was still slightly brighter than the rest, Rosie Clara. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and held it in her lap and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who keeps a list like that, who records the names of the people who made the difference in the way you might record a debt, except that it was not a debt in the usual sense because debts are meant to be repaid. And the names on this list represented things that could not be repaid, could only be honored, could only be carried forward. She understood that she was on that list. She understood what it meant to be on it. Not just that her father valued her, though he did, but that he had understood somewhere in the years of trying to understand what had happened to him and what it required of him, that what made the list was not the people who had loved him most easily or known him longest, but the people who had at a specific moment made a decision in his direction, who had stopped, who had stayed. She had been one of those people. She had opened the door that day in Scottsdale and stepped back from it and let him in and sat across the kitchen table from him and listened to the whole thing without the armor she had spent years constructing against exactly this kind of hope. She had taken the risk of the hope, and the hope had not been disappointed, which was its own kind of luck, the luck of a father who had arrived in time to be the person the finding had made possible. She put the notebook in her bag when she finished going through the boxes. She drove to the clinic. She went to the corridor with the photograph of Clara on the wall, and she stood in front of it for a moment the way Rosie Clara always stood in front of it. Then she went to find Clara. She was with a patient. Paige waited in the garden in the courtyard with the original plantings, the mint, and the tomatoes, the plants that mattered most. The afternoon light came into the courtyard at the angle that made everything exact. She sat with the notebook in her bag and waited. Clara came out 20 minutes later. She sat beside Paige on the bench near the mint and looked at her face. "What is it?" Clara said. Paige took the notebook out of her bag and handed it to her. Clara opened it. She read slowly. She read the page about the landfill and the 2 fingers on the neck and the pulse that was there. She read the page about Edna. She read the list of names. She was quiet for a long time after she closed it. "He wrote this in the dark," she said finally, "in that house." "Yes," Paige said. Clara turned the notebook over in her hands, the worn cover, the bent spine. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was assessing, with the full, clear attention she brought to everything. "He was very frightened," she said. "I knew that. Even then I knew that. Dangerous men do not look scared," I told him. "But I was also frightened." She paused. "I did not show it because there was no room for it. Edna needed me not to show it. The situation needed me not to show it. So I did not." She looked at the mint beside the bench, the mint that had come from the original plants in the original garden. "But I was." Paige looked at her. "You were 8 years old." "Yes," Clara said. "And he was very large and very damaged, and I did not know who he was or what he had done or what he would do when he came back to himself." She looked at the notebook. "I knew he was in trouble. I knew he was not a threat, not to me, not in that moment. But I did not know anything else. I just knew that the pulse was there and we needed to move." Paige said nothing. "Edna was not frightened," Clara said, "or not in the same way. She saw something in him that I saw but could not name, something that told her the risk was the right kind of risk." She handed the notebook back. She was almost always right about that, about what the right kind of risk was. I did not always agree with her assessments in the moment. I agreed with them afterward, usually. "This is one of the things she gave you," Paige said, "the ability to tell the difference." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the mint. "Yes," she said, "I think so." They sat in the garden for a while. The light moved through its afternoon arc. A nurse came to the door of the courtyard and looked at Clara, and Clara shook her head slightly, and the nurse went back inside. "He carries that list," Paige said eventually, "in his head, if not in that notebook. He has always carried it. I know, Clara said. Do you carry one? Clara was quiet for a moment. A long moment, the kind she gave to questions that deserved a genuine answer rather than the first answer that came. Yes, she said, but mine looks different. Mine is not a list of people who helped me. Mine is a list of moments, specific moments when the choice was available and I saw it and I made it. She looked at the garden. Edna taught me that those moments are the thing. Not the people in them, not the outcomes from them. The moments themselves, the space in which a choice is available, what you do in that space. Paige looked at the mint, at the tomatoes that were heavy on the vine, now the same variety Clara had been growing in this courtyard since she came back from her residency and took over the clinic descended from the plants in the original garden behind Edna's house. My first project for Dad's company, she said, was this. She gestured at the courtyard at the clinic around it. I designed it around the original plants. You told me to. You told me to, Clara said. You asked me what mattered most, and I told you the garden. You said the plants that are there when everything else runs out. Yes. They looked at the garden together. I think about that a lot, Paige said. When I am designing things, what the plants that are there when everything else runs out look like. What a building that functions like those plants looks like. Does it look like anything specific? Paige thought about it. It looks like a place where people can be honest, she said finally, where they do not have to perform anything, where the room itself is on their side. She looked at the clinic building around the courtyard. I think that is what you do here. I think that is what Edna did in her house. Clara looked at the building. At the window where her consultation room was the one with the photograph of herself in the corner outside it. At the sign above the main entrance with Edna's name on it. She would hate that sign, Clara said. Paige laughed. Completely. She would say the neighborhood does not need a sign, it needs a blood pressure machine that works. She would be right. They were quiet for a moment, in the way of people who are laughing about someone they miss, which is its own particular emotional weather, not quite grief and not quite oya and containing both. I am glad he wrote it down, Clara said, eventually looking at the notebook in Paige's bag. I did not know he had written it down. I am glad. Why? Because it means he understood it, Clara said. Not just what happened, what it meant. Some people go through things and they survive them, and that is the whole story, the surviving. She looked at the mint beside the bench, the mint that had come from the original plants. He understood what it meant. That is harder than surviving. That is the part that takes longer. Paige agreed that this was true. The afternoon continued to move through its arc. Eventually, Clara went back inside to see the next patient. Paige sat in the courtyard for a while longer with the notebook in her bag and the light on the original plants and the sound of the clinic operating around her. The sounds of a place that is doing the work it was built to do. Then she went home to her daughter, to Rosie Clara, who was growing up inside the story without knowing yet the full shape of it, who would learn it in pieces over years, the way all the important things are learned through proximity and attention and the accumulation of small decisions that over time become the person you are. The landfill was a park. The house was a clinic. The girl who had found a man in the garbage was a doctor. The man who had been found was the person the finding had made possible. The granddaughter of the finding was growing up inside the story, learning in the way things worth learning or learn how to stop. And all of it was there in the garden, in the mint, and the tomatoes and the plants that were there when everything else ran out. Alive, tended, continuing. That was enough. That was in the accounting of things, everything.